come today because I'm driving to a small town in rural Virginia to get my first COVID shot. And he says, I couldn't get shots here in Charlotte because all the things are filled up. But in the rural areas, in the Trumpian areas, they have all sorts of openings.
Fantastic.
And so the story is that the mind and the body. So what I'll be talking about is, how does a body learn in terms of the phagocytes, white blood corpuscles, T cells, how it uses memory, how it needs to be exposed to something, stressed to something, to be able to develop an immune system to deal with a COVID influx. And what I'd like to do is and my presentation will be about the difference between how nature works and humans think, because we need to move from the body and how it learns to the body politic and how it learns. And that's so any other last questions right now? Of course, we'll all get together at the end here to talk, but any other questions for Carlos specifically now? Can we share a screen? Okay, can people see that?
Yes.
Okay, so what I'm talking about is a phrase or sentence given by Bateson. The major problems in the world are the result of the difference between how nature works and the way people think. So I'm going to be giving 3 slides or so just about how nature learns through evolution. And I want you to hold that up as there. And then I'm going to move to Bateson's 3, what I see as his core insights into how social systems use these multi-level communication meta-mind aspects. And then I want to end up with the tools that cybernetics can use as we try to move from a family therapeutics to a larger social therapeutics. So my title is Parallel Universes. I changed that. Jerry said I had dual universes. No, parallel, meaning they work in parallel and they interact. And what's important about what Carlos says is the conditions for a double bind, interaction, an important relationship like survival, repetitive experience, a negative stress, but it's impossible to learn or change or modify, meaning there's no exit. So what I'm going to be showing you is what's happened in evolution, what's happened in the human sphere, and then see if we can make some conclusions. And the conclusion will be a triple vision of how do we need to move from what Blake said as Newton's sleep of first order paralysis of just seeing the world as things, to the second world of seeing you being part of mind, to the triple version of how do you change those systems. So that's what I'm trying to do. So what are the possibilities of systemic change? And the key concept here is strange causal loops. What's a strange causal loop? And so as I'm talking about these things, I want you to be thinking about the idea of interlevel interactions. In nature, self-organization. In human side, self-organization and self-reference. And then the aspect of emergent possibilities or properties. So interaction, the ability to look at self-organization and self-reference, the second order aspect, and then looking at how does emergence occur in that. So this is, I think, research that Bateson would have been interested in. when facing human attack, sperm whales abandoned the defensive circles they used against orca and swam upstream. Now, when whaling really started out of Nantucket, etc., they'd go to the Pacific. The first response of whales was to go into a circle, put their tails out, because that's how they defended themselves against orca. So they're all pooled together. All these ships would come in and have a mass slaughter. But then they learned to start moving upstream, not doing that. And so in the logs of the kill rate, etc., went down 58% over the course of the whaling seasons over years, because the whales learned something. So what do we mean when we take circularity seriously about these levels? And I have the article down there if you're actually interested. So what we're trying to do is, how does nature work? This thing over here, 50 million years ago, was the size of a fox. It worked in the swamps. 50 million years ago, it turned into the largest animal on Earth, as well as a hippopotamus, the same family. It evolved from that to that. It learned something in the interaction and the double bind, whatever you want to call the pressures that we have talked about. So I'm just using this as an example of how nature changes over time. And what Klaus talked about time is, that's a really important developmental aspect we need to be thinking about. Let me give you one more example. Just came out. Do you speak virus? Phages caught sending chemical messages. So we get something that's the smallest sliver of life, or the non-living, depending on how you classify a virus. They're communicating. They have memory. They don't have a brain. So a virus that infects bacteria listens to messages from its relatives when deciding when to attack a host. So if you look at viruses, they have three forms of communication. Me and not me. So identity. This is just a sliver of DNA, RNA type. Me and not me. Quanta, quorum sourcing, they call it. How many me's are there? So that's that. And then what's really fascinating is viruses sense chemical signals left behind by their forebears. So they can decide whether to kill or just infect the host. It's basically a word for decision out of Latin. And so they are able to map the landscape. So pneumonia was traditionally called the old man's blessing, because it kills you quickly. It sits there in your cells until the bugle sound says he's weak enough now. They all converge on the lungs, and he's dead. And so there's three forms of communication there. You're thinking about communication with the whale songs. Hey, this is a bad property sitting in a pod trying to kill orcas when these ships are coming. They're not orcas. So those are the three things. So there's an information processing memory. And that's what's important when we talk about, the difference between a genotype and a phenotype. Yeah, those are biological things, but it's information communication processing that we're really trying to get to. So here we go. The Red Queen hypothesis. Van Vollen's law, the Red Queen, species have to run or evolve in order to stay in place or else go extinct. And this comes from Lewis Carroll, who's just really profound, I think, in cybernetics. And Lou, I think, would agree with that. Now, see, it takes all the running just to keep in the same place. So the idea is evolutionary progress is an increase in fitness. One species deteriorates the fitness of coexisting species, but because the coexisting species evolve as well, no one gains, species gain and long-term increase, and overall the fitness of the system remains constant. So what I'm trying to really focus on is the epistemological link between the natural and the cultural. So this is what I think is the second most important phrase, apart from is what the problems of the world of nature works and humans think. What is the pattern that connects the crab to the lobster, the orchid to the primrose, and all four of them to me and me to you? If you look at the bottom, yeah, please.
Why not talk about a coupure épistémologique, as the Althusser would say? So, and why would there not be a break between us and the nature? So you have the four of natural, and then you have us, because also
there is but if you look at the bottom of my initial slides, it's called natural history. In the next set of slides, they're all called, so like follow the bouncing ball at the bottom of my slides, it's unnatural history. Okay. And that's what we're going to go to now is, oh, there is a difference here. There's a similarity. It's a metaphor. How do we look and learn from one another? In any algebraic formula, you need to look at the interactions, the functions. So here are the most important insights, I think, of Bateson. He said in a lecture in 1966, it's called From Versailles to Cybernetics, that there were only two events in the 20th century that were significant. Now remember, we had World War II, we had atom bombs, we had cars, all these things. But he only said two things were important that had consequence beyond the century. Because before, it was just repetition of previous centuries of wars, et cetera, et cetera. Why? Both understandings demonstrate the dual or parallel universe of limited human consciousness and the larger context that shapes subsequent history. Now, the picture to the right is the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, where the treaty 1918-19 was signed with Germany. Wilson, US president, comes over there and said, oh, okay, well, you know, we won, let them be. And the British and the French, being sophisticated international people, conned Wilson, said, we'll take care of your League of Nations, but we need reparations. We need to force those bastards down, those Nazis. No, or not Nazi, that was subsequent. We need to force them down. So what happened in 1989? Now, we all know the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, 90s, right? That was going to be the last year Germany would have paid its last payments from the reparations of 1918-19. It didn't, because it helped precipitate a larger context that shapes subsequent history. That's a cybernetic interaction. And the statement from Bateson that he made numerous times was, without understanding of the whole, disaster is inevitable. So that was what I see as his first, and if you notice down the bottom, it's unnatural history. We are the most unnatural of natural animals, and we need to get to what that difference is in similarities. Number two, this is when Bateson was with the Office of Strategic Services in Asia, having known Asian cultures, etc. And 6 days after the second bomb, atomic bomb on Japan, he wrote to Wild Bill Donovan, who ultimately set up the CIA. Now, after the close of the war, all agencies and groups were going to be laid down unless they had a purpose subsequently. So Office of Strategic Services was going to be laid down unless they came up with the rationale to continue. And Bateson gave them the 4-page memo that said what? Nuclear bombs were technical know-how that other countries will develop and increase in power. It's just a technology. Nuclear tipped warfare changes the dynamics of warfare. So he was able to see the systems interacting versus we have the bomb, we're secure now. Based on his anthropological studies of warfare, without validated knowledge of the other side, runaway positive feedback loops of fear will push the button. He understood how human societies work, that they would go positive feedback being on fears. Now, I was down in Washington at one of these dinner clubs with this Colonel Andrew Doherty when I was working on how do you defeat economic warfare of the Japanese. He says, you're sitting in the exact same chair when he was a junior Air Force guy, when they were saying, this is what the Russians have in terms of armaments. And the Air Force guy said, double it. No, triple it. And that's what they presented to Congress, was the triple threat of the Soviets versus what actually was. So what Bateson was talking about was real. So those feedback loops of fear will push the button. US and who else has a nuclear weapon must have the intelligence on the other side. Otherwise, compounding of images will create disaster. So in a system, you need people, and remember, there are people at the CIA that were the plumbers. They were under the Kremlin figuring out when Khrushchev pooped and analyzing his poop to see whether he was sick. To find out what the hell was going on behind the scenes. Okay? So he understood an unnatural reflexive system here. Third insight, and this is the most terrifying, and this is something that I've really kind of worked my own career around. Culture as a weapon against the white man. Now look at the chart, the little image on the side. One of the favorite tricks of the British when they found someone going against them was to strap them to the muzzle of a cannon and ignite it. That was their sport in India, to intimidate the people. Now, so you have a field, so what Bateson saw was a field of absolute economic, military, and political power of the British. How do you overcome that? And he wrote in a year before his nuclear insight to Wild Bill Donovan, another memo that said a new form of warfare will emerge from British India, where the local natives use culture as a weapon against the white man. Now think about that. How do you go against an absolute field of power? The Dio Bondi in the 1880s were trying to figure out how do we undo the British subservience of India. And just to make it clear, the Dio Bondi still operates and is a supply chain to Afghan Taliban for their intellectual rationales today. The Dio Bondi still is operational. But what it did is create two seeds. Gandhi was a good seed. Peaceful nonviolence as a feedback device to shame the colonizer. So the Billy Boys in Britain would say, don't cross this line. And Gandhi would line up from here to the horizon people that would cross the line. And the Billy Boys would go bang. And they'd then have the hospital already set up to take care of the people whose heads had broken open. But they'd keep on doing it until they got a feedback loop of why are we keep on killing or bashing these people? The bad seed was the horror of terrorism. In an asymmetric system, how do you fight back against it? I slit throats of journalists like Pearl. I cut off little kids' heads. So there is but they're using a cultural feedback loop to change the guidance system of the frame of the colonizer.
Quick question. Is that image a real photo or is
No.
painting?
It's a painting of
Painting based
a
on
real event, of real events.
real events.
Yeah, this is not conjecture. Yeah.
Okay.
This is how the British terrorized, and now you get a culture, a higher level of the economic, political, and military that's able to undercut the system. So what did we learn from our warfare is we brought culture warfare home to Smith College, to what Trump was a master of. So this is really a decreasing range of systems research and complexity of theoretical tools, but growing complexity of the phenomena under investigation makes systemic collapse inevitable. So decreasing range of the system and increased complexity of tools, but you don't know how to use them. But growing complexity of the phenomenon means it falls apart. Gregory Bateson was asked, what's sanity? And I love this response. After a few moments, he said, I suppose its sanity is familiarity with your epistemology, the way you know. How do I know I know? How does Stephen Nachmanovich able to go out to rural Virginia? I had to go to Frederick County, which is another county in a rural area outside Montgomery County, where I live, to get my first Moderna shot. Because here around Washington, everyone is sending 24 hours a day trying to get a slot for a shot. Up there in Frederick, Trump country, there were plenty of openings. I got there in 2 days. So most of us are governed by epistemologies that we know to be wrong. So that's the natural history, unnatural history, because the difference between self-governing and self-reference is that we've built a construct, a mind, a cultural environment through which we then interact, but we're not cognizant of. Very different than a Freudian subterranean blah, 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 because that's based on power. This is based on information. So survival is not bounded by the skin. The mind of the individual is eminent in the larger mind, to which our own is but a single part. So we deal with a meta communication. This is that strange loop I'm trying to talk about. How do you deal with strange loop causality? It's not linear. So you're dealing with movable, not objects, but informational spheres, if you will. A double bind, and I think Carlos was exactly on top. Double bind is not totally unique. It's every day. It's how that little fox-sized rodent almost turned into a 20-ton sperm whale. That was the learning aspect. So you're dealing with levels of abstraction and order of messages. And it's not just human communication, but communication and the interaction of a species and the environment that then goes to a sperm whale. How do you counter that? Here's I'm getting towards the sort of conclusion of what I'm trying to work for by talking about natural evolution learning, unnatural learning, and what the truth and consequences. That's what Bateson was saying in those three stories. There's truth in the design of your system, and there's the consequence of it. The consequence of Treaty of Versailles had embedded in its truth of epistemology how those French and English diplomats thought. So what is the triple vision needed to navigating this dual or parallel universe that undergoes a double bind conversation? The three levels of this triple vision is single vision and Newton's sleep. What did Blake and Bateson mean by Newton's sleep? Science as a looking at objects instead of as systems of interaction. So it's not between my body and your body, it's in the space in between, or the evolutionary space of that little fox-sized critter and a whale. or a hippo. Hippos are the same family. Do you know that hippos sleep underwater? I mean, it's fascinating. Anyway, so the idea of Newton's sleep is we used to have natural science and natural philosophy. Natural philosophy dealt with the wholeness. This dealt with the methods. So methodology of the worldview and the methods. Now we only have methods. And that's where the analytic reductive science is what the single vision. Double vision is how do I map the organization of the context, the system, the meta system, etc. So for me, cybernetics is the organization of the context and its consequence. Now, what we're trying to get to is the social therapy idea. We need a triple vision of learning how to learn, not just learning, because you learn within context, of how do you learn about learning. You're able to jump context and paradigms. So this is what Bateson said about learning. I think this is, levels of the observer's learning epistemology, big words. Levels of the observer linked with paradigms of learning. Now at the bottom here, this is the triple vision. Evolutionary processes and principles deal with creatures, as creatura, whatever, that Bateson used to talk about, that are implicit in a interactive system. As you move up, you can go from zero learning, which is stimulus response, Darwinian survival of the fittest, right? Does my claw get your claw and I kill you? That type of stuff. So it's evolutionary stimulus response, Newton's sleep. The next level up is reality kicks in, which is just observation. Whales are saying, hey, us guys are getting slaughtered. I'm going to communicate a couple hundred miles to these other pods in my dialect. They have dialects. And tell them, don't go orca pod, go upwind. And that's why 58% of the harvest of whales went down, because they learned. Informed experience, it's a kickback. When the horse kicks you, you don't go back to the end of the horse. Then level 2 learning is learning by testing falsification of the model. That's science. That's what we do. I set a hypothesis, I go there, okay, how do I test that? Oh, it died, it lived, etc. So it reveals the dynamics of the object in the observer's area. But you need to go to the observer of the observer's area of the third and fourth level. I'm informed, Jason is X-formed, being another creature from another culture. He's another male. I'm sort of can understand that part. So we are information X formation. And how do we look at that interaction space? But then what Bateson said, you trump all that, getting to real evolutionary epistemological principles by going to level 4, which is echo formation, the ecology of minds that then is able to bring up those bottom principles, processes and principles, and bring it back into the design of our human habitat. Because we just don't respond to nature. I respond to the light bulbs around me, to the carpet on the floor, to the heating in my place that I designed that may have toxic fumes coming out and kill me. But I've designed an habitat. So the question is, how do we design a habitat that has those evolutionary learning principles in our own social development? Bateson had this wonderful thing is social sciences were at that time 50, 70 years behind the hard sciences because they didn't understand levels of symbolic interaction. I put it as 100 years because it's 50 years since I knew him. So the progression of learning and the truth function epistemology under differing learning paradigms. And so there's levels here of how we work. Now, the next slide, and I'm getting towards the end here. What's a threefold vision? Look at the chart to the right. You have the zone of fitness over on the side, that's the interaction of the existing context. You see the blue lines from various squares. So let me give you an example. One square is America becoming the arsenal of democracy, helping to defeat Nazism, fascism. And so the idea was to go from toasters to tanks back to toasters, industry. The complexity was in the business networks. Then all of a sudden Sputnik went up. And our congressman said, oh, we'll just do toasters to tanks to toasters again. And some people were smart enough says, no, within that square, we're not going to win. It's about science and technology. It's a different paradigm. It's a different area of survival. And then we're able to then outcompete and land on the moon before and have Star Wars and Berlin Wall falls. So it depends on, so the first level is you're thinking of where you are, the context you're working within. That second, third fold vision is the larger library from where, in a democratic experiment, the emergent properties of that whale that you don't see in that, little fox-sized critter that's in the water, et cetera, is able to survive, and then says, hey, being on land is bullshit. These T-Rexes are bad. They didn't happen at the same time, but T-Rexes are bad, and I'm going to go to water full time. So a land animal that goes to the water, becomes totally water. So central thesis of systems, seen in conversation and learning theory, is that there is a discontinuity between a class and its members, or between the meta-symbolic system, the paradigm, and the system itself. We can talk about genotypes, phenotypes, but what we're doing is an analogy, and Jerry will try to get me on this one, I know, because he should, that it's not just a phenotype and a genotype, but it's how do those things learn in nature and in humans. So here is the threefold vision. This is what we're doing in our club of Remy. We have system structure, discursive environment, paradigms of conversation, institutions, rituals. We're pretty strong in this. We talk about anticipatory systems. We're talking about pathologies, etc. So what's the discursive environment? Then there's the phenomenological parameters. That's the experience, the image, the narrative, the mental models. Now, if you thought of these as balloons, I separated those two Venn diagram things because they are separate. You go too far away from that, you then get into the double bind, paradoxical, how do I resolve, etc. Now, what we have now is a discursive environment and phenomenological experience divorced from the key that Bateson wanted to point to. Ontological conditions for life. Now, what is that virus doing? It says identity, me and not me. Relationship, how many me's are there? Information, Joe's really going downhill, let's attack. Survival. Those are the systems. So system structure, mental models, system patterns. This is the threefold vision if you want to address Smith's College. And from a system standpoint, we need to be possibly thinking in those directions. And when discursive environment and phenomenological experiences become asymmetric, schismogenesis, power and powerlessness arises. So we're going from a Newtonian universe of power and powerlessness and information. How do you make those transitions here, folks? Schismogenesis, double bind can result in, and here's the most important phrase I learned by studying what happened in the Scottish Enlightenment as it went from the kings to thinking differently. It was ecological alienation, moving from that ontological conditions of life of what's essential to preserve your system, irrespective of, so it's the system, not the individual here. Health of the whole requires stewardship of all three domains. And so epistemology is how to learn about all three domains required to separate. And here's the new ethics: vicious cycles from virtuous interactions. What's the difference between a vicious cycle as Treaty of Versailles? How do I counter a vicious cycle? I use terrorism and cultural warfare. I trump it. You know, those are the insights that the unnatural Bateson understood. So what the hell are we talking about here? We're talking about a natural history of the most unnatural animal. So it's strangely causality, interlevel interactions of self-referential and self-organizing systems. Those three things I talked about before: levels of interaction, self-organizing, self-reference, and emergence. And basically, what I'm trying to get to is, what's the natural history of the patterns of observation, interaction, and conversation and their consequence? Let me just step back. What we have suffered from in the 20th century, and we suffer from now, is what Popper talked about, the failure of history, where you have Marx saying there's a linear progression of history to the new world. You have Freud talking about, let's go back to the archaeology of the mind and bring it forward, power concepts. If you deal with what are we doing in this great reckoning in the time of COVID, we're pulling down statues of our founders. We are doing what Jason is saying, what the hell's going on with this America? And what we're doing is realizing that the front lines of a cultural war is history. Because what's essential on the ontological side that I talked about? Identity. What Trump was a master of was putting that confusion into the thing, people then seeking an answer and him giving it. Oh man, this is like like in a church, a call response mechanism, call response, you know, it's all pre-programmed. So what Bateson really, I think, wanted, and what he beat me up about, was what the hell is natural history of humans, this unnatural animal. And that's why I went into cultural anthropology and cognitive archaeology to figure out. Now, yes, last week's presentation was all about the importance of history, looking at evolutionary history from organisms. I'm trying to bring that thinking with the human side to say, how do we sit there and look at this world? So, you know, what Mark Johnson, myself, system therapist, this is the natural history world. So we're truly trying to create a discovery of the formation of emergent intelligence embodied in the morphology or symbolic organization of perception concept of living organisms, systems. What Bateson said was, buried deep in perception are the laws of the universe we think we are thinking. Basically what he's saying is, in that perceptual world, just like the frog's eye, it doesn't tell what's out there. It tells what is needed for survival, pre-programmed at another level. So you can take, in that study, all the crickets or flies around a frog, anything it moves, it'll put its tongue out and try to eat. If you have nothing moving in this environment but has hundreds of dead flies around it, it'll starve to death because it's not programmed to see that. So here we come down to the whole system tools. This is sort of the last slide. So it's 4+1. This comes from Cabrera, which is, there are 4 tools of systems thinking. There are those who deal with perspectives. Today we've talked a lot about perspectives. We have a lot of representatives that think about mapping whole perspectives, reframing, etc. We have very few people talking about boundaries how they're formed, the contextual format of there. We have a fair number of people talking about relationships, and we have a few people talking about systems. So what is the four things that tools for dealing with the world is? You have a 4+1, the 4 here, and then natural history and unnatural history, which is what I just talked about. So in boundaries, as our tool set, we need to focus on circuit structure. Where boundaries are drawn, marginalization as a result of that drawing, who's outside, who's inside, legitimacy, how they're formed, sustained, and reproduced, the sacred, ontological, and profane dichotomies, the emergent boundaries and morphologies. Who's in this game? G. Sensor Brown is boundaries. Bateson, Maturana. The person that we need to get to talk to us is Alicia Guerrero, who's talked about enabling boundaries. They're not just the boundaries, but when you start constraining the system, it's able to pop up into a higher level of complexity, just like that little fox going to a whale, a higher level of complexity that solves the paradox, the double bind that is within. So we need to get tools for that boundary understanding. So it's what's the circuit structure? And I like this because having been part of micro LSI and the silicon world of making custom integrated circuits, how you design that circuit is destiny. Relationship. The focus is structuring processes. What are the processes that are structured out of that circuit design? In any circuit design, you have to have timers, time delays, gates, all that type of stuff, you know, just like we talked about. So complex causality. We need to talk about the distinction between not just entropy and the second law of thermodynamics, but syntropy, how things get together. That's why I enjoy Jerry Chandler's work. Is chemistry is the pre-cybernetics cybernetics of how things assemble and disassemble. It's not biology. It's how we then start linking. Looking at consequence. So what's the consequence of that, those processes? Second order. Who's in that game? Rosen, Robert Rosen, relationship models, biologist. We have Jay Forrester, systems dynamics. Von Forrester, Pask, conversation, low anticipation, Knowles, 360 intelligence. That's what I see. I'm not leaving anyone out intentionally. I'm just trying to give some examples. The systems tool thing is the focus is the patterns. And that's what Bateson was really trying to get about, is those pattern things. Whole part, build the capacity, coordination, regulation, organization, transformation, and evolution. So who was in that ballpark? Beer, viable systems, nature, ecology, Bateson, coevolution, Doug Engelbart, inventor of the mouse, hypertext, human interface with silicon computers. Now we are really strong in this perspectives of the focus is reframing, mapping the mess, construction of the lens, model for encoding, decoding. So Kenneth Boulding talked a lot about the image. Rosen talked about interaction environment. Jason deals with change. Jamie deals with gestalt. Knisley deals with innovation. So here are just some examples of the 4+1. Here's the 4 in natural history and unhistory that I tried to talk about today was what I'm talking about. So questions that I can respond to.
Lord had a raised hand.
Please.
Yes, that was left over from the previous time, but I can use it because I asked you about the natural versus the unnatural, and I liked very much from Bateson. He used somewhere I lost in the words. He takes them from Jung. He also has a notion of extensa and cogitans, and I think what is important in this perspective. Extensa is what is out there, that's nature. And cogitans we have in ourselves, we are ourselves. There's Descartes' idea that we are ourselves as a mind uncertain about everything. But the interesting step is made by Husserl in Cartesian meditations, not incidental Cartesian meditations, that he says what is interesting is not cogitans, what's interesting is cogitata. That's what about we are uncertain. And that what we are about what we are, that we are uncertain is not in nature, it is what we have constructed ourselves as a world. And that world, the cogitata, operate differently from the extensa, because the extensa produce entropy all the time. We know the second law. The cogitata produce redundancy against entropy, negentropy, however you want to call it. You can also call anticipations. Anticipations also have the idea that we go from a future back to a past, or we give meaning to things which have happened. Okay, I wanted to make that point.
And that's where a phrase from Robert Knisley is very important here. We were having lunch after one of Stewart's university seminars, and he used the phrase is that we need the capacity to predict the past. That's what natural history is understanding the structure of that finch beak when it came from Peru, got blown over or whatever to the Galapagos. It got to an area that had no predators. It expanded to the max and said, oh, I can't break open those hard things. I need a harder beak. And at the end, they have 6 different beaks for finches on the Galapagos. In that interaction, my model of beak has to change for survival. It's being stressed in the double bind, in a sense. So my morphology, my idea morphology must change. So we don't change beaks as much as we change models.
Bernard?
And that step has already been made in anticipatory systems by Dubois. Okay, I'll leave it to Bernard, of course.
Okay.
Well,
I'm trying to be brief, Lowell, and I'm trying to be courteous. I think, I'm presuming you're familiar with Occam's razor. Are you, William of Ockham?
Yeah, I
yes,
understand that.
most of us are.
Do not proliferate categories unnecessarily. And I find your thesis is difficult to follow because it's rich in all kinds of terminology and models and metaphors and so on. And somewhere inside there are some clear ideas waiting to get out, or waiting for me to discern. Now, you might consider that a bit impolite, but I'm familiar enough with—
It's not impolite. That's why we're here, is to present ideas unformed and held properly formed. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm familiar enough with Bates and von Persch and so on, all these people, to know roughly what they're about. Now, there's generally a consensus that, well, begin at the beginning. Everything is said by an observer. All distinctions are made by an observer. To make a distinction is to distinguish a system, an entity, something which is a constant in your world, an eigenvalue or an eigenbehavior. So there's what we distinguish. Now, we don't have access to the pleroma in Batesman's terms. We don't have access to the noumena. We have the creatura, which is our construction, our distinctions. It's we who make the distinction between the natural and the natural, between the biological and the cultural. If we're going to make those distinctions, they're for a purpose. And we can quite simply, I think, see how the biology works as an evolutionary process and distinguish that from the cultural as the symbolic process which human beings are engaged in. Although the waters get muddied when we see that amongst many animals, we have the beginnings of culture, or culture of a non-symbolic kind, in terms of they don't language and have self-consciousness like us. So somewhere in there, there are things we're trying to say. Now, the problem is that every one of us looks at these things in our own different way. So the first step is for all of us to learn that it's we who are making the constructions. And then we can try to make some agreements about what it is we're constructing. Now, if we're going to make the distinction between the biological and the cultural, we can at least clearly see that we're destroying the biological that part of our world. And if we look at the culture, we can also see that is a complete mess, as you've been and Carlos emphasized with schismogenesis and so on. So I try to keep the thinking separate, the biological from what, on the one hand, and then the cultural on the other, as a different domain of discourse, the symbolic, if you like. So the challenge then is, what do we do in this world of the social, the cultural? And the main answer there is the one given by Bateson, is make people aware that they have epistemologies, and that very often the epistemologies that they have are bad ones. So we're back to education. We're back to clear education, not just training people to be scientists or doctors or whatever, but training people to understand, to be cyberneticians in the full sense, second order cyberneticians and first order cyberneticians in a complementary manner. I think that's what we're about in this conversation, as I understand it. I'm just, okay, I just try to see through. You're a very fascinating scholar with a lot of richness in your thinking and your ideas, and you know, when we have Newton and we have that wonderful poet. Anyway, Blake, of course, all that wonderful stuff. But somewhere inside that is this key message, which I think we're all trying to articulate, and something that we all share.
Klaus, you want to say something?
Well, I didn't want to, but since you asked me, I mean, first of all, I think Lowell's presentation was really a worldview. Though I could not really make many detailed comments, but one comment I have to make is, I think you confuse nature with what we understand nature to be. For example, you say that the evolution from a land animal to a sea animal was one of learning. Learning is a human quality, cognitive, whatever. This is evolution. Now, evolution is not to increase fitness. No, that is a side effect. Evolution produces negative things that don't produce anything, and positive things. And in the end, what survives happens to be that what survives. It is not a purposeful system. And so learning is not appropriate. There are so many little things that I think you anthropomorphize the world. And I'm a little worried about buying into that. I think there's so many different kind of systems that one has to understand, and not just putting one framework over everything. And I think this is perhaps my general complaint about general systems theory, that it is supposed to be so general that everything falls into places. And I think we have to be much more specific, making differences where something applies, where it doesn't apply, how it works, etc., etc. I mean, I think that what you presented is really worth talking much more about it and in detail. And I certainly cannot really, I made lots of notes. One of the things is that I like very much is the issue of consequences, as you know, with critical cybernetics. That's what in fact I was always saying, that we don't look at the consequences, but this is not a question of whole versus part. This is a confusion, I think.
Stuart, what's in your mind? I know you want to say something.
No, I'm enjoying listening to others. Larry?
My psychic instinct says that.
I'd like to chip in.
Okay, Larry, please.
I have three comments that invite response. The first, following from Klaus, I'd like to see the term survival of the fittest discarded and replaced with survival of the fit. What happens in evolution is that the unfit are discarded, leaving what's left fit. This is a constraint-oriented approach to thinking, and I agree with Lowell that Alicia Duraro might be someone that might be worth contributing, asking to contribute to that.
Can I just respond to that? Is the term I like to use is moving from survival of fittest to the arrival of the fittest. And that
Yeah.
allows you to say the system is set to increase in complexity to respond to a bound contradiction.
But the word fittest implies that there's a competition, a contest, and that the fittest, the ones that win, are the ones that survive. And that's, I think, a misnomer.
Yeah,
What do you
if
think?
I were a salmon fish, I'm fitting to be the food of the bears, so I still arrive, right?
Second,
Second,
You're frozen, Larry.
Something happened.
okay, he's not connecting.
I'm
George,
interested
you
in-
want to have a
He's
comment?
back. Larry's back. Larry's back.
Oh, okay, he's back.
Sorry.
Hmm.
Yeah, the second comment is with respect to the word intelligence, and like, Jerome has commented on that in the chat, and it relates, I think, to Carlos as well as some other presentations. Ross Ashby defined intelligence as appropriate selection. And I find that useful. If you stop and think about it, appropriate, what qualifies as appropriate requires they specify the social context. And there's well-documented, maybe I shouldn't say well-documented, there's documented cases where a person who in everyday life gets labeled schizophrenic, who in certain circumstances becomes the expert, becomes the person who can actually address the situation that they're in. These tend to be very emergency situations requiring people to remain calm, and do what needs to be done. In the schizophrenic, this is the way they live their everyday life, so they become the person that's the most qualified to deal with the situation. The idea of creating a society in which everyone has some unique contribution to make is an idea that deserves, I think, some serious consideration. And the third is more of a proposal. This idea of intelligence and how we think about it relates to Lucio's presentation about economics, and particularly the rational man assumption that is in standard economics. Person Kate Raworth has proposed this donut economics, which challenges that idea of rationality. And it also brings in this balance that needs to be maybe had between the world we live in as a source of meeting the basic needs of all humans, on the one hand. On the other hand, designing our habitat such that it's sustainable, it continues and will continue to provide those basic needs that we need. So I wanted just to give a call out to Lucio and economics and how this might be something worth bringing into the conversation.
Jerome, Nicole, you had good comments in chat box. Are you there?
I don't think they're there.
Okay. Lucio, you haven't speak yet.
I enjoyed the presentation, the discussion. I'd like to narrow, and focus the discussion in the future meetings on some specific point of what we are talking about. It is, for instance, just learning processes, but then distinguishing what is learning processes of the human beings, within some kind of their systems, or supposed to be learning processes of the nature, or as we perceive it, or as we conceptualize the nature. So this could be well-focused issues to be discussed in future meetings. That's my suggestion.
Richard, George.
Well, I don't really have much to add to this. I just point to the chapters in my book that cover evolution and emergence and whatnot. But tried to
Yeah,
cover.
Jerome was back.
Yes, I was a little bit in the corner reading. I'm actually reading a book that was by an author that was mentioned last week, funny enough, Robert Ulanowitz, Growth and Development. Interesting book, Ecosystems Phenomenology. A lot of the topics I found today also interesting, this notion of intelligence. And for me personally, I'm writing a doctoral dissertation at the moment. I'm beginning with notions of rationality and how what we put into the model or what we assume, has an effect on what comes out. And I did see some of that mentioned today. So yeah, very interesting. Maybe at some point I could present some of the ideas I'm talking about as well, because I think they're related.
Yeah, just send me your topic and we will do a call for discussion.
Sure.
Mark, are you there?
Yep.
Richard, do you want to say something? You're muted.
I've been listening and trying to understand. I think the ideas about people being able to hold thoughts or concepts at multiple levels was very interesting. And the third force that needs to come in to help sustain that, I found useful to think about. So I think that was some of the work that Lowell was talking about. I'm still trying to understand what's happening in our society. Thank you.
Lowell, you want to conclude on that?
Yeah, Richard, your 360 model that you've used practically in the safety world has 3 levels, and that's one of the essential aspects of any system of change. You have the command and control consciousness that deals with the agenda, the work, the concept of the problems. This is the way we think every day. You have the middle level of the image, which is the model, whatever you want to call it, and that comes up with learning standards, principles, etc., that you talk about, context, structure. And then you have the ontological level that is, remember those 3 bubbles, discursive, phenomenological experience, and ontological. And that is the self-organizing system. And the self-organizing system needs to address the questions of how I process information, what is my identity, and my relationship to this outside world. So by looking at a 3-level world, you're able to now take what Bateson was talking about in general to actually a specific tool to be able to deploy that deals with the whole system, because what you're trying to do is define intelligence. And intelligence etymologically is in, not, tellin, count. Don't count. Read between the lines. How do you read between the lines? That's the key. Thank you.
If you make the 3 levels, 3 selection environments,
Thank you.
you are making progress.
Say that again, please, Luke.
Then if you make it in the 3 levels into 3 selection environments, which can be specified, then you get another pattern of evolution than the biological one.
Yes, thank you. That's brilliant, Thank you. I appreciate people sticking around.
Okay,
Klaus,
yeah, Klaus, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say this, the whole notion of there are 3 levels. I mean, I see many systems interacting. Physics has a different kind of system. You talk about natural history. it is actually physics denies the observer and describes the nature as it is without an observer. Then we have the social sciences where people are in the center. Then we have biology, then we have chemistry. These are all different kinds of systems dealing with different aspects of living, and they all interact with each other in certain ways. Some systems drop out with astrology, even though they're still in the newspapers, but there's an evolution going on between different kinds of systems that interact with each other. And I'm uncomfortable with having just three systems or a division between natural and unnatural. To me, in fact, there is no such thing as natural without an observer creating it. So I think we have to sort out a lot of epistemological problems that we're getting easily into when we anthropologize everything.